101,569. That is how many German and Italian soldiers escaped across the Strait of Messina in the same week that two of the most famous generals of the Second World War were racing each other to reach an empty city. Not a few thousand slipping through at night. 101,569 men, with their trucks, their tanks, their artillery, ferried across 3 miles of open water in full view of an Allied Air Force and Navy that controlled both the sky and the sea around them. The race made George Patton famous. It is still in the movies, still in the history books, still told as the moment he proved himself after North Africa. What gets left out is what was happening on the other side of that strait while the race was being run, what his own corps commander privately thought of how he was running it, and what it actually cost the men who were ordered to win it for him. We're going to tell you everything about this today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start at the beginning and then we'll move from there. This was not supposed to be a race at all. 5 months earlier, in February 1943, American troops had been routed at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, 6,000 casualties, and a 50-mile retreat in 8 days, the worst defeat American ground forces suffered against the Germans in the entire war. Patton was given command of the broken Second Corps afterwards specifically to fix it, and he did, driving the Corps to victories at Gafsa and El Ghatar within weeks. But the reputation of the American Army as a fighting force, in the eyes of the British commanders who still held most of the senior positions in the Mediterranean theater, had not caught up to what Patton's men had actually done. Sicily was where that gap was supposed to close. Patton understood exactly what was riding on it, and it was not modesty that made him care. In July 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily was built around a single idea. General Sir Harold Alexander, commanding the 15th Army Group, had given the British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery the main road north, Highway 124, running straight up the eastern coast through Catania to Messina. Patton's 7th Army, landing to the west along the Gulf of Gela, with Omar Bradley's 2nd Corps as its spearhead, had a different job entirely. Protect Montgomery's flank, take the airfields, move northwest toward Palermo if useful, but stay out of the way of the main effort. On paper, the American army that had just clawed its way back from Kasserine was being handed the supporting role in the largest Allied operation attempted since the landings themselves. Alexander's orders for what should happen after the beachheads were secured stayed vague, favoring the British advance by default and never spelling out what either army was supposed to do once the initial plan broke down. It broke down almost immediately. Patton signed off on the plan anyway. He did not like it, and the men closest to him already knew he did not like it. But there was nothing yet to fight about. That changed within days. The landings on the night of July 9th and the morning of July 10th were the largest amphibious operation attempted in the war to that point. More than 150,000 men going ashore, along more than 100 miles of coastline, backed by over 3,000 ships and 4,000 aircraft. They did not go cleanly on either side of the invasion front. High winds scattered paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne across miles of the wrong terrain before a shot was fired. And on the night of July 11th, as a second wave of paratroopers from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment came in low over the invasion fleet at Gela, an Axis air raid was already in progress overhead. One nervous gunner on one ship fired at the formation. Within seconds, every gun in the fleet and on the beach was firing at the same aircraft loaded with American paratroopers wearing American uniforms, carrying American equipment. 23 of 144 transport planes went down. 81 paratroopers were killed by their own side before they ever reached the ground. Dozens more wounded or scattered miles from their intended drop zones, with no idea which direction the front line was in. It remains, to this day, the worst friendly fire incident in the history of the United States Army, and it happened in the first 72 hours of a campaign that had barely started, in an army that was still trying to prove it belonged on the same continent as the veterans commanding the British force beside it. Eisenhower ordered an inquiry into what had happened over the invasion fleet that night, and the findings were quiet and uncomfortable in equal measure. No one was court-martialed. The investigators concluded that inadequate identification procedures and jittery gunners who had already survived one raid that evening were enough to explain it without assigning blame to any single command decision. The flight routes used to bring transport aircraft over friendly ships were rewritten as a direct result, a change that mattered less than a year later, when far larger airborne formations went in over the Normandy invasion fleet and needed every one of those lessons to still be in place. The British side of the invasion had its own version of that same night, a few days later, that rarely makes it into the story of the race at all. On the night of July 13th, 1,856 men of Brigadier Gerald Lathbury's 1st Parachute Brigade were dropped to seize the bridge at Primosole, the single crossing controlling the approach into Catania. Anti-aircraft fire and scattered drops broke the formation apart before it ever reached the ground, the same way the Americans had been broken apart 4 days earlier. Only 12 officers and 283 other ranks out of the entire brigade managed to reach the bridge and fight for it. Of those 295 men, 27 were killed, 78 were wounded, and 10 were reported missing. They held the bridge until dawn, then held the ground around it against German paratroopers of the 4th Fallschirmjäger Brigade for 2 more days. And it still was not enough to break the German line at Catania open. That was the fight Montgomery's army was actually having, while Patton's headquarters was arguing about road allocations. Neither army was chasing a beaten enemy in the middle of July. Both of them were bleeding for every mile. That was the environment Patton's army was fighting in when the argument over the race began. Montgomery's 8th Army hit the Catania plain and stopped, Primosole Bridge notwithstanding. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division and the German paratroop units that had bled the British 1st Parachute Brigade were still dug in along the approaches to Catania, and the flat, exposed terrain that Alexander's planners had assumed would be an easy corridor north turned into a fight over a few hundred yards of riverbank that changed hands more than once in the space of a week. Montgomery needed another road. The road he wanted was Highway 124, the inland route running through Vizzini and Caltagirone, and it was inside the zone that had already been assigned to Patton's 7th Army. Alexander gave it to him. He did it by redrawing the boundary between the two armies on the fly, in the middle of an active campaign, without a face-to-face conversation with the man whose line of advance it cut straight across. American units already moving up that road were ordered to stop, reverse, and clear the highway so British columns could use it. Traffic that had been flowing north was suddenly backed up for miles, sitting still, doing nothing, while the army everyone had been told was secondary to the main effort watched the main effort take the one road it had been using. Patton was furious, in a way his staff described carefully, because there was no safe way to describe it any other way. He believed, and he said so to the men around him, that the American army was being treated as a labor pool for the British campaign, useful for holding ground and clearing flanks, but never trusted to do anything that would put its name in a headline. Bradley, commanding 2nd Corps under him, felt the same insult, and said so plainly in his own account of the campaign written years later. Patton flew to Alexander's headquarters in Tunisia to make his case in person rather than by cable, because he did not trust a cable to carry the argument the way he needed it carried. What he asked for was modest on paper: a reconnaissance in force toward Agrigento and Porto Empedocle on the southern coast, to protect his own flank now that Highway 124 was gone. Alexander agreed to that much. What Patton actually intended, and what his own staff has since described in plain terms, was considerably larger than a reconnaissance. Within days, the reconnaissance in force had become a full drive on Palermo, the regional capital of Sicily, sitting on the northern coast, more than 100 miles from where the 7th Army had landed. Major General Lucien Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division led the way, and what his men did over the next 3 days became one of the defining marches of the American army in the war. 100 miles, much of it on foot or in trucks pushed to their mechanical limits. Through August heat and mountain roads, the Italian defenders had not expected anyone to cross that fast. The pace was hard enough on the infantry that the division picked up a nickname that stuck to it for the rest of the war: the Truscott Trot. Palermo fell on July 22nd, nearly undefended, its Italian garrison having largely melted away or surrendered outright. American war correspondents, embedded with Patton's army specifically because it was expected to see less action than Montgomery's, were suddenly filing front-page stories back home about the fall of a Sicilian capital, while Montgomery's army was still grinding forward, yard by yard, on the Catania plain. Newspapers that had spent the spring writing about Kasserine Pass were now running maps of Sicily, with Patton's arrow drawn all the way to the northern coast. Patton had his headline. What he wanted now was the one that would matter more. With Palermo secured, the 7th Army turned east onto Highway 113, the coastal road running along Sicily's northern shore toward the city of Messina and the narrow strait separating the island from mainland Italy. And it was at this point that Patton stopped pretending the word race was a figure of speech. He wrote directly to Major General Troy Middleton, commanding his 45th Infantry Division, that this was a horse race in which the prestige of the United States Army was at stake, and that they had to reach Messina before the British got there. He was not talking about tactics anymore. He was talking about what it would mean for every American soldier who had spent the last 5 months being told, quietly and not so quietly, that the British were the senior partner in this war, and the Americans were still the junior officers learning the trade. Bradley heard the same instruction directly. Patton told him to get into Messina just as fast as he possibly could, and Bradley understood exactly what that meant for how the campaign would be fought from that point forward. Years afterward, Bradley wrote plainly that the drive was not necessary on its own military terms. However rapidly they pushed into that city, he wrote, they could not cut the enemy's escape route across to Italy. The strait, not the city, was the objective that would have actually finished the campaign. Nobody with the authority to redirect the effort toward the strait instead of the finish line chose to do it. Montgomery, for his part, treated the whole idea with something close to contempt. He had the harder ground, the harder German units in front of him, and in his own account of the campaign, he never seriously believed there was a race to lose. That contempt did nothing to slow Patton down. If anything, it sharpened him. Patton and Montgomery had disliked each other since North Africa, and after the war, Montgomery would admit, with some reluctance, that the Americans in Sicily had proven themselves first-class troops. In the summer of 1943, watching Patton's army sprint ahead of his own, that was not a concession Montgomery was in any hurry to make. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. The push east along Highway 113 was not a parade. General Hans Valentin Hube's German forces were conducting a fighting withdrawal, trading ground for time along a coastline built almost perfectly for a defender, a series of steep ridges running down to the water, each one a natural line to hold, the San Fratello line, and then the Naso Ridge, forcing the Americans to fight hard for every few miles of road. Casualties mounted with each ridge, artillery and mortar fire from positions the Germans had ranged in advance, mines seeded into the only usable stretches of road, rearguard units willing to hold a position for hours at a time before falling back to the next one. None of it was the empty pursuit of a beaten enemy the word race implied back home. The men doing the fighting knew exactly how contested every mile of it was. Patton's answer to slow, grinding infantry advances up a coast road was to go around them by sea. Small amphibious hooks, landing troops behind each German defensive line before the main force reached it, had already been used twice on a modest scale earlier in the advance. On August 10th, Patton arrived in person at Truscott's 3rd Division headquarters to push for a third one, larger than the first two, timed for that same night, near the coastal town of Brolo. Truscott did not think there was time to get his infantry into supporting position before the landing force would need it. He wanted to postpone the operation by a single day. Bradley, when he heard the plan, agreed with Truscott. Patton was not interested in either objection. He wanted the operation to go forward that night, and it did. The job went to the 2nd Battalion, 30th Infantry Regiment, roughly 650 men under Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Bernard. On the night of August 11th, with a cruiser and a pair of destroyers standing offshore to provide naval gunfire, they landed near Brolo, 12 miles behind the German front line, and moved inland to take a height called Monte Cipolla, overlooking the coastal highway. For a few hours, it worked exactly as intended. Bernard's men held the high ground, sitting directly across the German line of retreat, watching the road below them that the entire German withdrawal was supposed to funnel through. Then the German 71st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, still fully intact and still fully capable of fighting, turned its attention on the isolated American position instead of continuing its withdrawal past it. Bernard's battalion spent the better part of 2 days fighting off repeated counterattacks with no ground link to the rest of the American advance, calling in what naval gunfire and air support could reach them, running low on ammunition and water under the August sun, holding a hill they had been told would only need to be held for a matter of hours. Men were hit and could not be evacuated. The radio operators kept calling in coordinates on a position that kept shrinking around them. By the time the lead elements of the main advance finally fought their way up the coast road and relieved them, Bernard had lost 167 of the 650 men he landed with. The Germans, meanwhile, simply diverted around the position, opened an alternate route further inland, and continued their withdrawal largely intact. The hill was held. The German force it was meant to trap got away anyway. Monte Cipolla was a bare, terraced hillside with almost no cover, and the men who held it for 2 days did it in full daylight under direct observation from German positions on higher ground nearby. Bernard's radio log from those 2 days is mostly requests for ammunition, for water, for the naval gunfire to walk closer to his own perimeter than any peacetime range regulation would allow, because the alternative was losing the hill to a counterattack instead. That pattern, an operation that cost American lives and produced a tactical result, but not the strategic one it was built for, would turn out to describe the entire race far better than anyone was willing to say out loud in August of 1943. Because while Patton and Montgomery were spending men and equipment to be first through the gates of Messina, the German High Command had already decided the city itself was not worth defending. On August 2nd, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring approved a full evacuation plan for the Strait of Messina, and on August 8th, he authorized Hube to begin executing it. The Germans called it Operation Leergang. Under the direction of Gustav von Liebenstein, the officer responsible for sea transport across the strait, German and Italian forces began systematically ferrying men and equipment across 3 miles of water to the Italian mainland, using ferries, barges, and small craft, running the crossings mostly at night and in the narrow hours around dawn and dusk when Allied air cover was thinnest and air crews that had been flying missions for weeks were at their most worn down. It worked far better than anyone planning the Allied side of the campaign wanted to admit afterward. Between August 11th and August 17th, the Germans evacuated 39,569 Wehrmacht troops, along with 9,065 vehicles, 27 tanks, 94 heavy guns, and more than 1,000 tons of ammunition and fuel. Italian forces had been crossing since August 3rd, and by the time the evacuation ended, they had moved roughly 62,000 additional soldiers to safety. Put together, more than 101,000 Axis troops, along with the great majority of their heavy equipment, crossed the Strait of Messina and escaped Sicily entirely, at the exact moment when Allied air power and naval power in the region were at their strongest and least contested point of the entire war so far. The Allied air forces were not blind to what was happening. Reconnaissance flights saw the ferry traffic building on both shores. Naval commanders were aware a crossing was underway. What never materialized was a coordinated, sustained effort to stop it, the kind of effort that air and naval superiority of that scale should have made possible. Concentrated German and Italian anti-aircraft batteries positioned on both sides of the narrow strait made low-level attack runs costly for anyone who tried them. The Royal Navy, for its part, was reluctant to push its larger warships into a 3-mile channel that could be closed on both ends, a caution some of its own officers later traced directly back to the memory of the Dardanelles a generation earlier, when British ships had been trapped and destroyed, trying to force a narrow strait against shore batteries. Nobody wanted to be the admiral who repeated that mistake in 1943, and so the strait that should have been closed by superior Allied power was instead left open by an institutional memory of a different disaster in a different war. None of that was visible yet on the morning of August 17, 1943, when the lead elements of Patton's 7th Army entered the city of Messina. The Germans and Italians who had been defending the approaches were already gone, most of them across the strait, and what remained of the campaign in Sicily ended not with a final battle, but with an empty city and a finish line. Patton got there first. British and Canadian forces, advancing along the coast from the other direction, arrived a few hours later. A British armored car unit under Brigadier John Curry reached the American positions not long after, and Curry is reported to have saluted Patton, told him it had been a jolly good race, and congratulated him on winning it. That was, by most accounts, the entire ceremony. No grand surrender. No mass of prisoners lined up to mark the end of the campaign, because the force that should have supplied both had already crossed to the mainland while the two armies were still counting the miles between themselves and the finish line. The scene got rewritten almost immediately, and the rewritten version is the one most people actually know. By the time Hollywood turned Patton's life into a film in 1970, the finish line at Messina had been restaged as a personal confrontation, Montgomery himself arriving to find Patton already waiting, the two of them trading a loaded glance in front of the cameras. It made for a better scene than the truth. Montgomery was not there. He did not need to be. A brigadier commanding an armored car unit delivered the only word that mattered, and the men who actually fought the campaign, on the hillsides above Brolo and in the riverbed below Primasole Bridge, were not in the shot at all. In Washington and at Allied headquarters in Algiers, the reaction to how the campaign had actually been run was quieter than the newspapers made it look, and less flattering to everyone involved. Alexander's handling of the boundary between the two armies, the vague orders that let the argument over Highway 124 happen in the first place, drew criticism after the war from officers on both sides who felt he had allowed personal rivalry to substitute for a coherent plan. Eisenhower, watching from Allied force headquarters, valued what the race had done for American standing in the alliance and said little in public about what it had cost to get there. Privately, the lesson that seemed to land hardest, with Bradley and with the planners already beginning to sketch the invasion of France, was that letting two commanders compete for a headline was not the same thing as directing them toward the objective that actually won wars. The 38-day campaign for Sicily cost the Allies roughly 24,850 casualties among American, British, and Canadian forces, close to 6,000 of them killed outright, and the rest wounded, captured, or missing. Axis losses on paper looked heavier, roughly 9,000 killed and 45,000 wounded, with another 125,000 taken prisoner, most of them Italian troops who had little interest left fighting for a government that collapsed, with Mussolini deposed, before the campaign was even over. But the number that mattered most for what came next in Italy was the roughly 101,000 who did not appear on any casualty list at all, because they had already reached the mainland with their equipment, ready to man the defensive lines that would make the rest of the Italian campaign one of the longest and costliest of the entire war. Many of the same units that slipped across the Strait of Messina in August 1943 were dug in at Salerno within weeks, and at the Winter Line and Monte Cassino within months, extracting a heavy price from the same armies that had just spent 5 weeks driving them off an island. 7 Allied divisions would still be fighting their way up the Italian peninsula against those same forces nearly 2 years later. Patton got his headline. 7th Army beat 8th Army into Messina by a matter of hours, and it became the story that followed him for the rest of his career, cited in his own defense whenever anyone questioned whether the American army under his command could match the British in the field. He believed the prestige was worth what it cost, and he said so plainly to the men who served under him. Bradley, who fought the campaign at his side and watched him overrule Truscott at Brolo in person, came to a different conclusion and put it in writing once the war was far enough behind him to say it plainly. The race had been won. The army it was supposed to destroy had not been. Whether the men who did not walk off Montecuccolo would have agreed with either general is a question nobody asked them, because most of the ones who did not walk away were not able to answer. The soldiers who survived that stretch of the campaign carried it quietly for the rest of their lives. Some of them went home to Missouri and Ohio and Texas and never mentioned Sicily again, except in a line or two on Memorial Day. Some of them stayed in touch with the men who had been on the hill with them and no one else, because no one else would have understood what those 2 days had actually felt like. A few of them, decades later, tried to explain to children and grandchildren what it meant to hold a piece of high ground for the sake of a headline in a newspaper 3,000 miles away, and found there was no good way to say it that did not sound bitter, so mostly they just stopped trying. The men who fought that last stretch of the campaign remember the specifics more than the finish line. They remember the hillside at Brolo, the sound of German armor moving on the road below them in the dark, and the hours spent wondering whether the relief column would arrive before the ammunition ran out. They remember the paratroopers who never should have died over Gela, shot down by the same Navy that was supposed to be protecting their approach, and the British paratroopers a few days later who fought their way to a bridge with a fraction of their brigade and still could not break the line at Catania. They remember watching German columns pull back along roads they had bled to reach, and finding out only later that those columns had simply been ferried across the strait to fight another day, on another beach, against the same men who thought they had finally beaten them off the island for good. We should not forget. Was your father or grandfather with the 7th Army, the 8th Army, or anywhere in Sicily in the summer of 1943? Tell us his name in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.